there's a new wave of conservative black people popping up, and it's increasing recently, where you start seeing people all of a sudden they hit their stride on social media, and everyone just follows them because they're black and they come across as conservative. Some of them are more prominent, but there's this thing going on right now where they're calling themselves conservative, but they're not. And when I think of somebody who's conservative, I think of somebody who does not want the government in our business, who does not want the government pandering to us for votes. That doesn't mean that they don't do things as far as legislation that help the black community. Obviously, everybody wants that. That's why we vote people in. But they're doing this thing now where if the Conservative Party or Republicans want black voters, they should do A, B, C. But that goes against what conservatism is. We're not supposed to be distinguishing each other on skin color. And when you do that, you're acting like a Democrat. So while there are voting blocks, everybody knows there's voting blocks, and the community has a demand, that doesn't mean that the politicians should be soliciting these things for I'll say 4 votes from a black or a Hispanic or an Asian or a white demo. That's just not what conservatism is about. It is about limited government. So when you start hearing black conservatives talk about reparations and stuff like that, be wary. Be wary. They realize that they're not getting anything from the Democrat Party, so they think that they're going to get it from the conservative side, and I don't see that happening. Hopefully it doesn't happen, because if that happens, we are no longer conservatives. We're now liberal, because that's what liberalism is. It is about appeasing blocks based on characteristics, whether it be natural or chosen. So if you want to change your gender, that's who they pander to. If you have distinctive characteristics, natural, black, yellow, brown, whatever skin color you are, if you're purple, they want an appeasement, and it's the exact opposite of what Dr. King wanted and asked for. And why our civil rights movement succeeded was we wanted to be judged based on the content of our character, not the color of our skin or other characteristics. So when people start saying, well, this is what we want, and then you can have our votes. Again, doesn't mean we don't say, hey, we want these potholes fixed. We want these parks with grass instead of concrete. That's going to happen regardless. But it shouldn't be happening based on our skin color. It should be happening because we are civilians and we're voting in public servants to do these things. So I want to make that distinction, because I think that's important. But when you start asking them for money, that's different. When you start talking about slavery, that's different. That's liberal. That's liberalism at its core, because they feel guilty over slavery because the Democrat Party is the party of slavery, and they think the way to atone for it is to pay us money, because they think money fixes all problems. It doesn't, of course, but they think that it does. Why? Because they don't have any money, and they attribute a number to comfort, and that's not always the case. In fact, it's almost 100% of the time it doesn't help at all. All it does is create new problems. People think, well, if I had $75,000 a year, I would be X. So when they get to that $75,000, I was talking to somebody about this earlier, then the goalpost moves. Well, if I could just make 6 figures and hit that $100,000 mark, I'll be more comfortable. Well, different problems arise. So we set these goals based on our current problems. And then when we hit that goal, we have a whole new set of problems and issues. And I think that's where people get lost when they start asking for things like reparations. They really think that can help anyone. And it won't, and it can't. On top of the fact that you can't determine who derives from slavery anyway. And it's not only black people. So when I hear these so-called conservatives saying things, I start wondering why they're saying them. And I have to assume they're knowledgeable, so I take it as disingenuous rather than being idiots. So when I see somebody like Pastor Darrell Scott, who I respect half the time, every time we talk about a problem in the black community, he wants to point the finger at other people in it. That's just not what conservative people do. We own it. We believe in personal accountability, personal responsibility. We don't point fingers. So if you say, hey, black people make up 13% of the population, and we account for 35% of all abortions, that's an insane number. And then when we add to that 50% of that 13% is women, and then there's a smaller percentage of those who are having abortions, we still account for 35% of all abortions. It should be terrifying, because that's one of the main contributors to our staying at 13% of the population. Another one would be murder, when we commit, half of all homicides in this country. And again, we only make up 13% of the population. Half of that are men, and it's still a very small fraction of those 6.5% of the population that are committing these crimes. It's not like, okay, well, half of that 13% are killing people. That's just not the way it works. It's not what's happening. It's a minute fraction, and we're still able to pull off killing half of all homicides in this country. That's concerning. But you hear these black conservatives say, well, white people do the same thing. Especially when you talk about black on black crime. For some reason, that's a taboo topic, and they cringe and they get upset. How dare you talk about our problems? Well, then you have to identify a problem in order to solve it. And when you have a very large segment of our demo refusing to acknowledge that as a problem, and in fact saying, well, white people kill white people, who does that help? What does that do? Where does that mindset come from? The automatic inclination to point your finger right back when somebody says, hey man, we have a problem here. Well, I don't hear you saying anything about white people. Well, I'm not white, so why would I? When we get to the economic status that white people are at, and in society where we feel we're equal, then we can start talking about white people. I don't understand the need to bring up white people every time we're talking about our issues. Why do we point fingers? It's a deflection. It's also a projection. To say, oh, well, that it's common for a demo to commit its crimes within that demo because that's what's in the vicinity. Makes perfect sense. But when we're talking about it as a problem, why do we point the finger at white people? What do you hope to gain from that? Shouldn't that be their concern? And the fact that we're still outperforming them in negativity, that should be our concern. It shouldn't be, well, what about white people? I don't hear Republicans, or I don't hear so-called black conservatives talking about white people. Why would we? That's what they need to talk about. And if you don't like them talking about our issue, maybe we should solve that issue. If you think there's some underlying tone behind it, that still has nothing to do with the fact that we commit half of all homicides in this country. So why are you talking about white people every time? It's so weird. hey, we got to get this thing under control. It's almost like if there was a pipe that bursts in your home, and your wife says, hey, we need to fix this, and you start talking about other people whose pipes burst in the neighborhood. What does that have to do with what I'm talking about, honey? It's so weird that we do this. But it's worse because we're talking about homicide, black on black crime. We're talking about 6,000 to 7,000 of us a year dying at the hands of other black men. And instead of talking about a solution, we immediately say, well, white people kill other white people. You're minimizing the problem. You're minimizing black people dying. You're minimizing our men dying, our boys before they can even become men, our families being destroyed. You're minimizing all that when you say, well, what about white people? And you dismiss those statistics. That doesn't save lives. You're not helping anybody by doing that. You are helping people by acknowledging it and saying, okay, so now what can we do about this? Because we always talk about we need to have an honest conversation about fill in the blank social topic. But when it comes to murder, we don't need to have an honest conversation. We need solutions. But we do need you to be honest and admit that there's a problem in order to address the problem. I don't understand it. It's a very childish way to approach a problem, to point fingers and say, well, the rest of the class did it. It's toxic. It's dangerous. Literally, it's getting people killed because we can't address our issues. Because the first thing we do is blame somebody else. And even if you're not blaming somebody else, you're just bringing up, well, you do it too. You know, if your 7-year-old curses, and you say, hey, knock it off, you can't do that. Well, you curse. Is that acceptable? I mean, you may learn something by your 7-year-old saying that, but that's not acceptable. And that's not a means to stop them from behaving the way they behave. It shows you something you can work on, for sure. So, hey, white people, guess what? Apparently white people kill a lot of white people. Now, how does that, let's get back to the topic. And let's address it. How do we address it? Figure out solutions and present them to our local governments. Instead of saying get rid of police, figuring out how policing can actually work to help this problem. It's the only way for us to get out of the situation we're in. We can't keep blaming other people. We can't keep flipping the script. Well, you did it, and then think that that's you think that that's acceptable. Because it's offensive, especially when you just buried somebody and you hear somebody say that. You can't just say, oh, well, yeah, that's true. I think white people do the same thing. That's not your concern. Concern is the person you just buried and you're trying not to bury anymore. It's disgusting. It's disgusting. It's disgusting. There's no other word for it. Because you're minimizing problems that are costing us lives, that are costing us a percentage of the population, a large percentage. And it's not even close. The percentages and the rates of the crimes we commit and the amount of people dying, it's not even close to any other demo in this country. If 6,000-7,000 people died in a war in a year, we would be talking about genocide and trying to figure out sanctions and other actions to take against this, whoever the dictator is. When we do it to ourselves, we start pointing fingers. You can't blame a president. You can't blame politicians.